Good evening and welcome students, faculty, staff, and guests to the second CAMD Scholar presentation for the 2012-2013 academic year. My name is Aya Murata and I'm the CAMD Scholar Coordinator. At this time I'd like to ask you all to please silence any electronic devices that you might have brought with you this evening. Thank you. The CAMD Scholar program was established in 2006 and allows selected students to pursue independent summer research projects related to diversity, multiculturalism, community, and/or identity with the guidance of a faculty advisor. For those of you who are interested in applying for the CAMD Scholar program, please note that the deadline for applications is February 6th. Information about the application process is posted on PANet, on Campus News, and we will host an info session on Wednesday, January 23rd. Additionally, any member of the CAMD office is more than happy to speak with you if you have any questions. As well, I'd like to note that a selection of past papers are posted on PANet under the Students tab in the CAMD module. So tonight, I am excited to introduce to you Nikita Singareddy. She is the inaugural Barbara Landis Chase CAMD Scholar. The BLC CAMD Scholar designation is given to a student whose project most closely aligns with research related to race relations or human rights in the United States, with preference for projects that address issues from a historical perspective. A 3-year senior, Nikita currently hails from Michigan, while on campus she calls Stimson House home. Nikita is co-editor-in-chief of Frontline, is the director of engagement for the Philomathian Society, and a leader of Cafe and Power and the Andover Ethics Society. She has worked for the Obama campaign and is currently working for the Young Women's Christian Association in Michigan in their advocacy legal department for race and gender-related discrimination. She avoids sports at all costs, loves reading novels from authors including Vonnegut and Huxley, is a huge fanatic of British comedy, and plays way too much Tetris. Without further ado, please welcome Nikita Singareddy.
Yes, I am using a step stool. Hi everyone, and welcome to my CAMD Scholar presentation, The Perversion of the American Dream. Deconstructing media portrayals of sex workers through critical analysis and honest narratives. But before we jump into my presentation, I'm going to give you a map of what's going to happen. First, I'm going to cover the methodology and terminology behind my research, as well as tell you a little bit about the people I interviewed. Secondly, I'm going to give you an introduction to sex work in the media, a brief history of sex working, prostitution, sex trafficking in the United States, then go on to debriefing the films that I watched and the analytic constructs that I created after watching them. Then conclusions through sex worker narratives. I'm going to open up for questions and conclude with 2 video clips, and we're going to break off into discussion groups. But first we need to understand, what exactly does it mean to be a sex worker, a prostitute, or a sex slave? A sex worker is defined as someone who explicitly exchanges their own erotic labor for money, services, or goods. Some examples of sex workers are strippers, burlesque dancers, escorts, hustlers, prostitutes, etc. The word sex worker was coined by researcher and former sex worker Carol Leigh in the 1970s and has since been used by NGOs and in academic work. Sex worker is an all-encompassing term for any and all sex work. It's the most clinical and therefore used throughout my research. Prostitution is the act or practice of providing sexual services to another person in return for payment, although payment may not always be received. The person who receives payment for sexual services is called a prostitute, and the person who receives such services is known by a multitude of terms, including John. There are actually 3 types of prostitution: street walking, brothel prostitution, and escort services. And since the 80s, some prostitutes themselves, including many advocacy groups, reject the word prostitute and use sex worker instead. A sex slave a sexual enslavement is defined as under the Roman Institute of the International Criminal Court as the exercise of any or all of the powers attached to the right of ownership over a person. Sexual slavery includes situations where persons are forced into domestic servitude, marriage, or any other forced labor that involves sexual activity, as well as the trafficking of persons for sexual purposes, frequently women and children. It's also critical to understand age and gender diversity. There's an individual out there in the world of every age in the sex industry. The same goes for every gender and sexual identity. However, to narrow the scope of my research and for legal purposes, all of my interviews were with individuals over the age of 18. And because a vast majority of individuals in the sex industry are female, most of my research is related to this gender group. After this, I watched countless films and television serials relating to sex work. Drawing my own conclusions about stereotypes, I went on to deconstruct them in interviews. And these are just a taste of the movies that I watched. So that tells you I was in front of the TV for a long time. And here's a little bit about the 6 people that I interviewed for my research paper. The first is Alice, who's a current graduate student and sex worker from New York City. Victoria, an outreach coordinator at HIPS, helping individual prostitutes survive in Washington, D.C. Gabrielle, a sex worker from Chicago. Lincoln, an escort from Chicago. Jane, a sex worker and sex worker advocate from the Northeast area. And Marcus, an escort from Washington, D.C. All these names that I used for the paper are actually pseudonyms to maintain the identity of that individual. It's also really important to recognize that these perspectives are different because I went through advocacy organizations and outreach programs. So if I had interviewed someone off the streets from a red light district, which is the term for a sex work heavy zone, their perspectives may have been different. An introduction to sex working in popular media. Media now occupies a prominent pinnacle in American society and has come to contour the way Americans view many facets of the world around them. Not only has it transformed the social, political, and economic organization of our society, but the media has also begun to shape our very ways of seeing and knowing. According to renowned sociologist John Thompson, the primary concern of the media is to elicit a reaction using images and scenes. Sometimes the media uses stereotypes disguised as national American traits, a part of the American scene. Thompson suggests that reiteration in the media ingrains certain stereotypes and images into an audience, especially if the reaction to those images are strong and repetitive. Sex working in the media is a unique phenomenon. Viewers have deemed sex working fascinating yet reprehensible, two directly conflicting reactions. And so the media responds to these reactions by catering to both, creating characteristics of sex workers that fit the audience's contradictory desires. Images of sex workers are grouped into one narrow stream of information cinema, where fiction is portrayed as reality and fact. Because fiction and drama rely on dramatic elements, there are a whole variety of constructs in sex working that the media disregards, such as psychological impacts on sex workers, sexuality, the male-female gender binary, empowerment, disempowerment, socioeconomic realities, and societal consequences. The way we engage with the world is through our perception and understanding. Consequently, the narratives of sex workers in mainstream media combine and reflect how society understands the sex industry. After observing various films and television serials that have defined sex work in the media over the years, several stereotypes and paradigms have become apparent. This CAMD scholar study examines the representations that persist about sex working, giving consideration to the common stereotypes, their persistence, and the response of sex workers and non-sex workers to them. Further, it aims to examine in depth the methods by which these stereotypes are perpetuated. This history will help us to understand why, during certain time periods, sex workers were treated and portrayed in different ways. Prostitution in the United States is considered to be older than the nation itself. Arriving with early European settlers, sex for hire quickly pervaded this new American society as poor and working class men and women crossed borders to find new futures, enduring systems of bonded labor and indentured servitude. The sex business flourished between 1880 and 1920, concomitant with waves of migration to the US and America's rise as an industrial urban nation. The lower class and high class looked to sex workers as a means of escape and revel. The 1900s set the stage for what a number of scholars have identified as a racialized social panic called the white slave trade. It forged a campaign to abolish prostitution through control of women's movement, and in effect, exercise control over women's sexuality. During the progressive movement in the decade preceding World War I, a frontal assault on prostitution was undertaken, specifically in the United States. The issue of sex working culminated in 1910 with the passage of the Mann Act that outlawed interstate sex commerce and the closing of red light districts under the requirements of war discipline prior to the US entry into World War I. In the post-World War II era, with the new surge of capitalist globalization and Western economies in recovery, Male labor migration demanded for new and expanding industries in the Northern Hemisphere. Women were pushed back into domesticity, their mobility and sexuality severely restricted. When the conservative coalition dominated US Congress from 1937 to 1963, the sex industry faced increasing stigma. Prostitution zones were hidden and pushed further into immigration districts. The color lines of the sex industry reinforced racial prerogatives and disenfranchisement of larger society. Despite the mid-1900s targeted sex trafficking. Despite these efforts, instances of trafficking have increased, as contemporary estimates today say that 800,000 to 4 million humans have become victims of sex trafficking each year, of which 50% or more are women and children trafficked into the sex industry. The industry remained covert, for the most part, to deflect increasing government control in the Carter administration. Sex workers finally responded in San Francisco in a social revolution of gay rights, women's rights, and sexual freedom. This resulted in the formation of the first sex worker activist organizations. There still remains thousands of sex workers here in the United States. Though there is still a principal immigrant sector in sex working, domestic sex work has recently bourgeoised under recent circumstances. The global recession, increased college tuition and loans, the media that has glamorized the sex business, easier advertising ability through venues like Craigslist, My Red Book, and Eros. Since there are ambiguities in a definite number of sex workers here in the US, my research does not focus overwhelmingly on statistics, but rather concentrates on the highly emotive cultural and identity issues surrounding the industry. Now onto the films. The synthesis of comedy, sex, and redemption were common during the reign of exploitation films in the 20s and early 30s. These films are categorized by exploiting lurid subject matter. After The Road to Ruin, one of the earliest documented sex working films in the United States was shown, audiences would receive a lecture and pamphlet on the evils of the evening and preventative measures to turn children away from moral forms of decay, like prostitution. But then, the motion picture producers and distributors of America began to censor films under an increasingly conservative government. CAMD, an American romantic comedy about the life of a Parisian prostitute, received approval in 1936. The film features Marguerite, who was born into an impoverished family and improves her life drastically by becoming a successful courtesan. Whilst under the protection and guidance of a loving and friendly pimp, CAMD portrayed the life of a shiny prostitute as a great escape from poverty. It too represents the idea that pimps could be brotherly figures who never forced their women to do anything. Defining Marguerite's life as classy and refined labeled courtesans as a staple in high society life, something distant, wealthy, and exquisite, an art of sorts, and in a weird way, beautifully tragic. Then came the 1960s, nostalgically described as the counterculture and social revolution near the end of the decade. The lauded and controversial Oscar-winning film Midnight Cowboy follows Joe Buck, a naive young Texan who moves to Manhattan to become a male prostitute. He meets a petty thief named Ratso Rizzo, who first sees Joe as an easy pawn and basically becomes his pimp. Up until the release of Midnight Cowboy, films that represented prostitution as simply transactional, gendered profession, wherein men paid for services from women. However, Midnight Cowboy defied cultural consciousness by changing this gender role stereotype. Rather than a typical relationship between a pimp and a female prostitute, Joe Buck and Rizzo convey the construct of hustler and pimp. Midnight Cowboy also plays on the familiar hooker with a heart of gold character through Joe. He's earnest and amiable, a nice country boy with an ugly past, trying to make it in a profession that demands an edge. Before this 1969 film, almost all sex working films portrayed female prostitutes belittled either explicitly or implicitly by men and patriarchy. But for Joe, there is no gendered reason that he enters prostitution. He faces no gendered marginalization either. The happy hooker was a total reversal of Midnight Cowboy in the portrayal of sex workers. The happy hooker plays like a 70s soap opera. Big hair, gaudy and bedazzled clothing, and ABBA crooning in the background. The film is almost a success story in reverse, starting with its heroine being named Secretary of the Year in her native Netherlands and ending with her imprisonment in New York on charges of operating a brothel. Xaviera Hollander is the stereotypical image of a sex worker with her sexy, leggy, and blonde physique. She's also extremely confident, happy-go-lucky and naive from beginning to end of the movie. Though she experiences minor setbacks, for example, almost as soon as she's put into prison, she's released. Life only goes well for her, as she moves from fiancé to well-liked prostitution to New York's most famous and illustrious madame. In her unbelievably easy and quick transition from office girl to working girl, audience sees Xaviera's conditions approved and a luxury in this life. Her positive energy makes prostitution, as one audience member described it, extremely fun and rewarding. There appears to be no emotional consequences or change in her personality. After the release of The Happy Hooker, sex workers and scholars were frustrated with disillusioned portrayals of sex working. They took it upon themselves to elucidate the true image of sex work amidst all the cultural stereotypes and movie representations. One activist was feminist Lizzie Borden, who directed the film Working Girls in 1986 as her politically motivated commentary on prostitution. The fictionalized day-in-the-life docudrama is noted as one of the most revealing and honest looks at female prostitution ever committed to film, offering viewers a refreshingly deglamorized glimpse into the day-to-day operations of a modern brothel. Working Girls accomplishes the goal of depicting prostitution as just another ordinary, if exhausting, job. The film's tone is clinical and neutral, as it tries not to sensationalize its topic. Working Girls wants to express a point about the mechanization of the sex act by its repetitive nature in prostitution. Then, just 4 years later, Pretty Woman was released and is now arguably the most famous film about a prostitute. Vivian, played by Julia Roberts, a kind-hearted and earnest prostitute on the mean streets of Los Angeles, stumbles upon the lost and lonely business guru Edward, played by Richard Gere. They immediately create a bond and share a night of passion, which soon becomes a week-long partnership. Vivian is transformed Pygmalion style, from the street-smart hooker provocatively dressed to a sophisticated and coiffed young lady. Vivian's heart of gold and her vulnerability both remain unchanged as she and Edward fall in love. Pretty Woman solidified a paradigm known as the prostitute's American dream, or the hooker's fairy tale. Sex activist Carol Leigh, who termed the word sex worker, regards Pretty Woman as a synthesis of Hollywood cinema that relies more on the appearances of hookers and world cinema, that focuses on the quest of hookers to achieve a state of security, safety, prosperity, and happiness. The introduction of the film also obfuscates the difficulty of Vivian's life before meeting Edward. She lives in a dilapidated apartment. Her roommate steals her money for drugs. Pretty Woman's classic 1970s cinematography continues to face criticism for recycling Hollywood's portrayal of the beautiful prostitute, just as stunning in boots and a leather miniskirt as she is in a red ball gown. Vivian's relationship with Edward is another topic for analysis. This Cinderella-styled film renders sex for hire as a way for couples to meet and establish loving relationships. Sex worker critics point out that Vivian's transformation is merely the process of being pimped, as portrayed by Hollywood and Disney. Charlize Theron's prostitute protagonist in Monster is a complete characteristic foil to Julia Roberts' sweet and innocent Vivian. Instead of using the already successful Hollywood formula for films about prostitution, the director employed the other media stereotype of sex workers: dirty, cheap, exploited, drugged up, and angry. This is the bleak and desperate backstory of Eileen Wuornos, one of America's first female serial killers on death row. Viewers are thrust into the hard reality of Eileen's present life. She's constantly disgusted with herself and humankind as she masochistically revels in prostitution and the beatings and physical abuse she receives from men. Suffering from multiple personality disorder and desperate to keep the affection of any lover, she turns into a serial killer. Monster depicts prostitution as a profession that is sordid, foul, and rough. Eileen is a street hooker, meandering highways and servicing in shabby hostels. The movie conveys the brutality of prostitution in a naturally explicit way, causing the audience to cringe and sympathize with the disturbed and tragic Eileen. This portrayal of sex working took the real-life story of a prostitute murderer and projected Monster as a harsh reality of many hookers. It reinforced the stereotype in the news and media that street prostitutes were immoral and damaged individuals. In almost every film and television series I watch concerning sex work, there are two distinct modes in which a sex worker is portrayed. I've created and termed this the hooker's dichotomy. Mode 1 is the high-class hooker, and Mode 2 is broken into two parts: the dirty streetwalker and the despondent sex slave. To help analyze this dichotomy, the direct quotes of the 6 men and women I interviewed are voiced by PA students for legal reasons. These words are from first-hand understandings of sex working and its effects. Mode 1, the high-class hooker. The first mode contains the characteristics of a glamorous, sexually powerful sex worker. He or she is very much in control of his or her destiny. The high-class hooker operates in a big city, generally under a sexualized pseudonym. Some examples of Mode 1 are French courtesan Marguerite in Camille, Xavier Hollander in Happy Hooker, and Vivian Ward after her dramatic transformation in Pretty Woman. Victoria, who works with sex workers and victims of sex trafficking in DC at HIPS, thinks that the most alarming feature of this sex worker stereotype is the characterization of confidence and freedom.
I agree with your analysis that sex workers are often portrayed as having much more agency over their situations than in actuality. Not every sex worker, in fact few that I know, are that confident or fully protected in their profession. The media seems to think that these high-class prostitutes have no fears whatsoever. Films and television shows trivialize the sex workers' emotional troubles because producers are trying to maintain the image of the sexy, dominant, and powerful hooker.
Alice, 26, completely agrees with the hooker's dichotomy. She began experimenting in sex work in New York City before it became her profession. And although she believes sex working may not be for everyone, in her situation, she says that it works.
People are often surprised that I'm well educated. I work outside what I do in the industry, but people don't think that's possible for sex workers because of the media-generated dichotomy. A smart hooker doesn't necessarily correlate to an exorbitantly wealthy prostitute.
Lincoln knows a few prostitutes who live as abundantly as some sex workers are portrayed in the media. He's a 34-year-old Chicago escort, with a friend who makes more than $200 grand from prostitution. However, Lincoln doesn't think that the beautiful and rich sex worker is the best portrayal of sex working.
Some people have the assumption that all sex working is fabulous, but most people's situations aren't like that.
The second mode is split into two parts, the dirty streetwalker and the despondent sex slave. The streetwalker characters are often drug addicts and implied to have poor health and are sexually transmitted diseases. Many are immigrants or come from domestic broken homes and histories of sexual abuse. They are coarse and unrefined. They blame society for their situation and poverty, sometimes festering in anger and discontent. The sex slave is frail and grimy, a consequence of the torture, exploitation, and rape he or she experiences. Some examples of Mode 2 are Joe from Midnight Cowboy, Gladys and Mika from Law & Order SVU, Neil in Mysterious Skin, who was molested as a child and becomes a gay prostitute, and Eileen in Monster, who is raped and turns to a life of prostitution in her hatred of society. In Alice's opinion, too many people think Law & Order SVU is an accurate representation of sex work.
Prostitutes portrayed as good for nothing. They wear trashy outfits, turn tricks for little money. They are dirty and impoverished. These prostitutes are almost portrayed as subhuman. But they're still human beings. The show has it so wrong. I don't know one prostitute who lives like that. It's sad how many people think SVU is the reality of prostitution in big cities. Narratives like mine are never portrayed in the media. They're not dramatic enough.
Marcus, however, isn't sure how he feels about his place yet.
I'm still trying to understand my role in the sex industry. I don't always enjoy the work I do, and sometimes I'm embarrassed. My story doesn't relate to being poor or incredibly wealthy. Sex work is just a living like any other. Sometimes it's boring, other times it's awkward, but most of all, it is a daily struggle like an office job. In Mysterious Skin, Neil is a prostitute trying to discover himself. I was never sexually abused as a kid, but I'm trying to find myself too.
The characteristics in the hooker's dichotomy are so repeated and recycled that stereotypical traits of sex workers merge into a four-standard character and plot stereotype as particularized by the prostitute's quadrant. The prostitute's quadrant emerges from identifying sex workers and prostitutes as commodified objects. This quadrant is derived from Horn and Pringle's 9-category typology, itself based upon fictional literary works. However, this research uses the Horn and Pringle typology that has been modified and updated. It condenses the original 9 standards into a set of 4 and uses film which is more suited to contemporary data and current ideological influences. In this approach, films are mapped onto a quadrant of sex worker portrayals that reflect overarching cultural beliefs and values regarding sex workers, such as how they behave, how they look and dress, and what occurs in their lives. The dialectic dimensions for sex workers in the media within the typology are good versus evil, punished versus unpunished. They communicate two key elements of drama, character and plot. Good versus evil refers to the sex worker's character, which is composed of traits, behavior, and motivation of the central figure. Punished versus unpunished refers to the plot of the text. It defines the outcome of the action and summarizes what happens to the character. Evil unpunished. The archetype of evil but unpunished prostitute, which is termed Evil Eve, is traceable to the biblical figure of Eve in early Christian literature. In such texts, the dramatic emphasis is placed on the coexistence of seductive and evil traits in the same woman. Her destruction of the men she attracts is depicted as almost accidental or careless. The Evil Eve figure is a survivor despite her evil ways, and no punishment is meted out to her. In Present in Kyrie, this archetype is represented by the character Lola Lola in the film Blue Angel. Lola Lola is glamorized as the glamorized version of Evil Eve as an alluring singer-performer who enchants and then destroys Dr. Wrath, the main lead. When she marries him, she exhibits male sexual role prerogatives, first by seducing him, then by supporting him, and finally discarding him for a younger partner. Wrath's decline is traced by his loss of money, social position, self-respect, and ultimately life itself. The narrative implies that she is dangerously seductive, portending disaster for any man captivated by her siren song. At the end of the movie, Lola Lola goes unpunished. She is depicted as unrepentant, unchanged in her ways, and by implication, destined to enslave other men in the future. Good unpunished, also known as the hooker with the heart of gold. It's derived from a romantic tradition that emphasizes the innate goodness of humanity, and from Christian doctrine originating in the forgiveness of the prostitute Mary Magdalene. Vivian exemplifies the prostitute gifted with the innate good character despite her messy exterior at the beginning of the film because she learns how to consume properly. Edward begins her education and consumption by hiring her as an employee. They make a business deal in which her services are given in exchange for his money. The film turns sentimental when Edward becomes the prince and rescues Vivian by proposing marriage. Before the final scene, Vivian gives evidence of rescuing herself by planning to finish high school, training for a job, and most importantly, rescuing others. She saves her friend Kit from a life on the street and Edward from a life of empty greed, fulfilling her role as the reformed hooker and a kind woman. Good punished. This archetype is labeled the hapless harlot. The character standard focuses upon social forces that drive individuals into prostitution. Often the narrative centers around an innocent person who is seduced, abandoned, and left to a life of misfortune and poverty. The character of Gladys in the episode Survivor of Law & Order SVU exhibits this pattern. Gladys, who goes by the name Sunshine, is the only survivor of a serial rapist. When detectives visit Gladys, they find that she prostitutes herself to pay for the rent to live in her aunt's house. She also tells the story of how she entered the sex industry. A man identified her vulnerability, showered her with affection, made her fall in love, and then forced her to sleep with other people to make money for their family. At the hospital, the audiences discover that Gladys is pregnant. She is happy with the chance to have a baby, because the hapless harlot is given an opportunity to escape her destructive lifestyle of poverty and sex work. However, Gladys's aunt kicks Sunshine out. Now the hapless harlot who began the process of change is knocked back into poverty and homelessness. Repeatedly falling into hardship, this sex worker character archetype believes that in every instance he or she tries to change their future, life points them back in a direction of sex work as the only way to survive. Gladys's baby is born. However, she skips town with her pimp and leaves the care of the baby to XVU detectives. In her parting letter, she writes, she doesn't know anything other than sex work. Her pimp even laughs and asks, how can a child be proud of a mother who is doomed, humiliated, and full of shame? The hapless harlot, despite wanting to change his or her circumstances, never breaks free. Evil punished. This sex worker character standard is derived from the early Christian view of pagan goddesses as seductresses who leave their lovers to ruin and death, and then are killed themselves. In Monster, Eileen commits her first murder after she's raped. Combining that event with the horrors of her past, Eileen sets out on a predatory journey, killing all men for they are the source of all of her emotional pain and damage. Her final victim is a kindly older man who picks her up, not realizing she's a prostitute. Upon seeing that she's in a desperate state, he offers her money and a place to stay with him and his wife. She does not want to kill him, and is visibly distraught as she agonizes over what to do. However, being the archetype of the wicked woman, she does kill him in the fear he will blow her cover. During her killing spree, Eileen tries to justify her murders by casting all potential victims as violent abusers. In Eileen's mind, society as a whole targets her. Authority figures not only fail to protect her, but contribute to her victimization. As a child, Eileen's father punishes her for being the object of molestation. As an adult, Eileen is twice picked up by a police officer and forced to perform oral sex on him. After being raped by a John, Eileen stops hooking and tries to secure a legitimate job. However, she's humiliated and rejected at every place she applies, and ultimately returns to hooking with a vengeance. Audiences are drawn to sympathize with and recoil at Eileen, even as she's in her final scenes on death row. Though Eileen's execution is off-screen, audiences feel conflicted, a sense of satisfaction that the murderer has received justice, but sorrow that Eileen was created from the system and deserves more understanding. Conclusions. In the media, there are a couple of statistically effectual ways to attain an Oscar statue or Golden Globe bust. The best way is portraying a sex worker on screen. At least 13 Oscars have gone to actresses portraying sex workers, and even more films with sex worker content have been nominated for Golden Globes. It may be for this reason that the scope of sex working in the media is so narrow. Every film and television series uses a similar formula to produce popular portrayals about sex working. Beyond awards and critical acclaim, the audience is the other medium that director and producers want to impress. Knowing that the already existent preconceptions about sex working are there, the media continues to feed the limited sex worker depictions. Directors either want characteristics of the high-class worker or the sex slave/streetwalker. Unfortunately, the traits of either sex workers are so pigeonholed that every portrayal becomes the same. The characteristics of Belle in The Secret Diary of a Call Girl are similar to Xaviera Hollander's in Happy Hooker, which are similar to Marguerite's in Camille. Backgrounds and storylines may differ slightly, but the strong female sexuality, dominance, sultry nature, and beauty are very much comparable. The media has one goal for these characteristics: to arouse and electrify the audience. These traits so successfully cultivate that reaction that the media finds no reason to diversify their high-class hooker portrayals of sex workers. The characteristics of most media streetwalkers and sex slaves are also homogeneous. All sex worker images in the media derive from the 4 sex worker archetypes: Evil Eve, hooker with a heart of gold, the hapless harlot, and the wicked woman, in one way or another. This raises the question, with how much depth and understanding are sex workers portrayed in the media? The truth is that these repetitive characterizations and characters have become more than just stereotypes. These fictions have now become the only realities. By repeating these narratives, they are generalized. No narrative of sex working is unique anymore. They are all the same, and audiences have heard it before and will probably respond in the same way every time. These are the things that I identified as the greatest problems in sex working films. Of all the films that I watched, there were less than 5 with the female character of color. Furthermore, there are only 2 ways to view everything about a sex worker. In her sexuality, he or she must either be hypersexualized or so downtrodden that they barely have a sexuality at all. The same is conveyed about gender. A character either is sexually dominates the opposite sex or is overpowered and sexually abused. And a sex worker either has no vulnerabilities or too many. These media portrayals never go beyond a shallow portrayal to profoundly understand how the male-female gender binary affects sex working. It never probes the question about the actualities of victimization and agency, consent and coercion, societal consequences, and the true pain of victims. Because of these stereotypes, when we are told about different and true narratives of sex working, it is hard for audiences to proffer a reaction as stirring as those elicited by the media. Of the people interviewed for this research paper, all of their lives were so different and touching, but not nearly as dramatic or sensational as Pretty Woman or Monster. Audiences have unintentionally trained themselves to react in 2 ways to sex working. But when the true narratives fit in between the dichotomy or don't match the quadrant, the truth doesn't have the same impact that is easily fostered by media portrayals. Every film and television show on sex working has some ideological bias, and by refusing to further probe into sex working, the media's biases have resulted in a dead-end scenario, which is either pro or anti-sex work. However, sex working is not two-sided. The multifaceted industry needs multifaceted portrayals. These assumptions and myths have underscored sex working discourse for too long. Now that these stereotypes have been identified, the way to deconstruct them is to take the narrative of today's US sex workers and show how their realities and features are more than just a script. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, they can now come up and ask them, I guess. Okay, Virginia? I actually went through outreach programs and organizations. So all of these people that I interviewed were those that were safe and people who felt that they could go to these organizations. Kevin?
I know you said you didn't interview a lot of male prostitutes, but was there like a gender difference as to what part of the chart they fell under? Like, was there more like people eat women than men?
Well, that quadrant is used for the movies, so I can't really put people's real life stories into there. But because, you know, they're male or female, there are significant differences between two groups. Yes?
What is your favorite media stereotype out of those?
I don't think I'm supposed to have one. Yeah, I really don't have a favorite one because after seeing these movies, obviously I thought, great, you know, time to go interview people in there. Stories were so different to what I thought. I saw these sensationalized films, and personally, I thought that Law & Order SVU was the real story. That was the sex worker of the United States. But after interviewing 6 people, there are people out there like that, but a lot of people are middle class. It's just like you and me. There's upper class individuals in sex work, middle class, and lower class. Yes, Edward?
Do you think prostitution should be legal?
Well, actually, that wasn't a part of my research, and I specifically tried to leave that out. And I actually still don't have an opinion about it because I was only able to interview a certain type or certain types of sex workers. I wasn't able to just go out on the street and interview a streetwalker because my parents said no, even though I asked. So my conclusions might have been different if I was able to do that. And until that point, I will get back to you. Mrs. Sykes.
Thank you, Nikita. This is really fascinating. I was curious how this became a project for research for you.
I went to India 2 summers ago, and the neighborhood where my mom grew up is a red light district in India. So if you walk down the streets there are women sitting outside of really dilapidated housing, and they ask men or even women walking down the streets, would you like to come inside? And seeing that just stirred something inside me that I had to understand what's going on here and why is it in the United States that, you know, it's not prevalent, and why in the media do we see things differently than what I'm seeing when I walk down the street here. So that's essentially the reason behind doing this project. Okay, then second part of, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I never closed that then. Oh, I'm sorry. The second part of my CAMD Scholar presentation is breaking off into discussion groups and talking about the 2 video clips that I'm going to show you. You just got a little bit of one. So I'm using some of my fellow cafe members to help me do this, so could they come up to the stage? 4 different discussion groups, which are whichever area you're closest to. So the the upper part of over here can meet over here, and that will be led by Darlena. The middle to back area by Laz, and this middle area by Kat, and the corner by Gabby. So I guess you guys can go up into that. So before I start off my presentation, could all the cafe members just ask everyone in their group that they're grouped with to just say their name, where they live, and yeah, that's it.